we'll go straight to Congo, and all the photos that I'm showing are taken by Johan Persson, a photographer that I work a lot with. And this is Shukuru Kahindo. She was 25 years old when we met her. Now she's 27, and she lives in Congo, Kinshasa. I met her 2 days after she had given birth to these 2 twin sons, and she lived in a refugee camp in eastern Congo, Kinshasa, quite close to Goma. She had fled her home after there had been fighting between rebel troops and army troops, so she fled her home and just ran out into the woods. On the way, she lost track of her husband. She didn't know where he was, and she walked by foot, 8.5 months pregnant, and arrived just before giving birth to her sons in the refugee camp. She was quite depressed when I met her, and she didn't really know what had happened to her husband. She was worried about him. She didn't even own a plate. Yet she told me that she knew that she was actually quite lucky, because when it was time to give birth to these 2 boys, she got to meet a doctor. And that was really good for her, because that saved her life when she needed a cesarean section. Because today, the most dangerous thing a woman in a low-income country can do is to become pregnant. There are, and this goes for all of the world, in 2 in 5 pregnancies include some kind of complications, and in 15% of the cases, the situation is life-threatening for the mother. And that makes women very, very vulnerable if there is no doctor around. The reasons why it could be life-threatening is that the baby might be too big for the mother's pelvis, so it doesn't come out, or that the mother's womb won't close, so the bleeding doesn't stop. That is very, very common. And it happens, as I said, in all countries, all over the world, and those are problems that usually cannot be foreseen and cannot, therefore, be prevented. And like I said, if there is no proper health care, then it means that the woman will die. This map shows some of the countries with the highest maternal mortality death ratio, and some of the countries with the lowest, and I think you can guess which ones are which. But the bigger the bubble, the higher the mortality rate. And in figures, this means that every minute a woman in the world dies of complications related to pregnancy and childbirth. Each year, 500,000 women and 7 million infants die due to poor maternal health care. And altogether, that's more than die in malaria, AIDS, and tuberculosis altogether. But the difference is that pregnancy is not a disease. So in September 2000, the United Nations set up the Millennium goals, and those are 8 goals that should be reached before 2015. Number 5 says that in 2015, the maternal death ratio should be decreased by 2/3. That won't happen, because that is the goal that has the least progress right now. As a whole, it's actually hard to find any evidence that it is decreasing. And why? Well, I don't know. It just hasn't been a top priority so far. So we're going to Malawi here. This little country in Eastern Africa is just a little bit bigger than Swedish Lapland. It has 13 million inhabitants, and 9 out of 10 are subsistence farmers. Just a little more than half the population can read, and 75% of the population makes less than $2 a day. So in a country like Malawi, 1 in 18 women die during pregnancy or after delivery. As a comparison, in Sweden, it's 1 in 17,400, just to get some proportions. So why is it like this in Malawi? Well, I mean, there are it's a complex picture, of course. There are several reasons. One is that people, like I said, are quite uneducated. Women don't always know or understand or want to go to the hospital when it's time for delivery. Women become mothers very early, which increases the risk. And they also have many babies, which also increases the risk for the woman. And there are, in some places, also this kind of fatalist views where you see it as part, this circle of life, that women die sometimes when they give birth. But the main reason, the absolute main reason, is that Malawi has 13 million inhabitants, but only around 170 doctors. There are more Malawian doctors in the city of Manchester than there are in all of Malawi. So simply, there is lack of health personnel. So these big bubbles that we see here in this map, they are not only countries with high maternal mortality, but they are the poorest country of the poor. This goes hand in hand. Countries like Malawi can't afford to train doctors, and once the doctors are trained, they leave the country faster than you can say baby. They go to countries like ours, where they're being paid better. And 10 years ago, the death rate for mothers was even higher. Only Liberia and Afghanistan were more dangerous countries for a mother to be. So, let's meet Frankston Dua. He's here performing a C-section at Zomba Central Hospital in Malawi. However, he is not a surgeon. He is not a doctor. He is what they in Malawi call a clinical officer. He is a non-doctor performing rather advanced surgery, as you can see. He started working with this 12 years ago. Before that, he had been a medical assistant for 20 years. In Swedish, there is not really a name for that, but it's what they call it there is a medical assistant. And he was given 3 years of training in surgery, out of which 1 semester was practice at a local district hospital with a mentor by his side. And after that, he was ready to start working. And this speed training in surgery of health workers with long experience, in average, the selected people who have all worked in the health sector as nurses, medical assistants, or something like that, they have together an average experience of 7.5 years when they're being recruited. And this idea was partly initiated by a Swede. He's called Staffan Bergström and is a professor at Karolinska Institutet in Stockholm. And he got this idea together with some colleagues of his when he worked in Mozambique during the 80s, when there was a war between Mozambique and South Africa. And at this war, which was a very horrible war, all the local doctors fled, basically, the country. But he still kept getting reports about C-sections being performed in different rural hospitals. And they were, of course, being performed by people who knew how to do it, in theory, but were not trained for it. But they had to do it for women to survive. So this gave him the idea to try to set up a real safe and qualified training for these kind of criminal surgeons. Today, there are some kind of non-doctors performing surgery in 25 out of 47 sub-Saharan African countries, and the number is increasing. So in Malawi and Mozambique and Tanzania, those clinical officers, they perform 90% of all cesarean sections in the district hospitals. Well, I'm quite sure that all of you now wonder that if I was pregnant, would I go to them? Would I dare to let them work on me? Well, I think actually I would. At the beginning, resistance was quite high among doctors worldwide because they were afraid that it was going to be substandard care, that we were going to settle down and say, yeah, well, fine, great. You know, they don't need as good health care as we do, so let these guys work on them. But studies that compare the mortality rate and also the complication rate after surgery among the patients, they compare doctors and non-doctors who've performed these surgeries, they have yet not find any detectable differences. You cannot measure any differences. They don't die more often and they don't get, more problems. But there are other differences, positive ones. One is that the cost to train one clinical officer is 1/3 of the one if you're going to train a traditional doctor. And another equally important thing is that in a survey from Mozambique, they found that 88% of the non-doctors still worked at small district hospital 7 years after graduation. Among doctors, the figure was 0. So this means that also people from smaller villages and rural areas get access to proper maternal health care. So why do they stay? Well, the reasons are quite simple, because their training is not recognized here. So our part of the world doesn't drain those countries of those particular brains. They get to stay there. Also, since the average of previous experience was 7.5 years, this means that they usually have had time to settle down and have a family. And it still happens, but you are much less likely to leave your family in that situation, also at the same time as you can make a living at the place where you're at. So recently, Staffan Bergström at Karolinska Institutet, the Swede who is part of building all this, he received an award, and it's called the Distinguished Service Award from the International Federation for Obstetrics and Gynecology. And what I've heard is kind of like the Nobel Prize in those areas. And he got it even though he doesn't work with either obstetricians or gynecologists. So maybe this shows that the world is about to change, that we are starting to recognize and acknowledge the potential in this. Well, meanwhile, Frankston Dua and his colleagues, they continue to work. I wanted to give something back to my country because it has treated me so well, says Frankston Dua. Some days at the hospital are really, really tough. Hours are long, and many women, they wait too long to go to the hospital, so they cannot be saved when they come in. But mothers who do come in on time, they survive, and every day new babies are born. So hopefully, one day, women in those parts of the world will, just like me, worry more about the pain they might feel when it's time for delivery instead of being afraid of dying. Thank you.